Welcome to A Date with Darkness podcast, where we discuss the impact of hurtful and abusive relationships and how to overcome them so that we can move through our pain to find the healthy relationships we want, need, and deserve. I'm your host, Dr. Natalie Jones. I'm a licensed psychotherapist based in California. Well, I hope that you find the podcast educational, informational, and entertaining. Please note it should not be substituted for treatment with a licensed mental health professional. Also, as a special side note, some of the information presented on the podcast is triggering in nature to some of my listeners, so please note that listener discretion is advised. Hello and welcome back to the show. I hope that you guys are all doing well and staying safe amid the pandemic. I appreciate you joining me here for this hour, and I do have a very special guest planned for our show today. But before we get into it, of course, I'd like to start by talking about some general housekeeping issues. As you know, the podcast does have a Facebook group, a Date with Darkness Facebook group. So if you're looking to support other people as well as get support for yourself as you are recovering from an abusive or, toxic or unhealthy or narcissistically abusive relationship, come on over and please join the Facebook group. The link to the group is in the show notes. Please make sure that you answer the questions for the group. Those who do not answer will not be admitted to the group. And if you find this podcast to be enjoyable, informative, helpful, to you, and you think it could be helpful for someone else, please remember to share and support your podcast by liking it and subscribing to it. And if you want to keep the conversation going, please do join me on social media, Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. Those links are also in the show notes as well. You have a question for me you'd like for me to answer on the show, or just a general issue, a topic, or you want to make a suggestion, please do email me at adateWithDarkness@gmail.com. Please remember to keep those emails very short and concise, straight and to the point. Sometimes I get emails with pages and pages and pages, and I do try to read and respond back to all of them, but there are some that kind of get very lengthy, and it takes a little bit longer to kind of sift through. And as always, please know that I do enjoy you as my listener, so thank you so much for joining us today. I have a very special guest today by the name of Quandra Chaffers. Quandra is a licensed clinical social worker. She is a sex therapist, a sex educator, EMDR instructor as well. And I brought her onto the show today to talk about a unique topic, which I've thought about and have worked with some clients on, and that is BDSM and trauma. And for the first part of the show, and for the second part, which will be next week, or will air next week, I should say, we did bring Quandra back to talk about EMDR. So I think these are two very great interviews, and I can't wait to see what your thoughts are. But I definitely wanted to cover BDSM and talk about how trauma may play a part in BDSM. And I've also included other topics in which we talked about, which include rape-based fantasies and things of that nature. So without further ado, here's my interview with Quandra. Hello and welcome to the show, Quandra.
Thanks for having me, Natalie.
I'm so excited to have you back on. This is a redo after we recorded a couple of years ago, and it was on my computer that got a virus. So I'm super excited to redo this show with you. So for my listeners that are not acquainted with you, can you tell us a little bit about who you are, what you do, and what drives the passion behind your work?
Most definitely. So, I am a trauma specialist and a sex therapist, and I'm located here in the San Francisco Bay Area. My private practice is helping mostly survivors various forms of violence, like sexual violence and intimate partner violence, move out of the stories of what's wrong with me into the stories of that was just something that happened to me, finding healthy relationships, healthy sexuality after trauma. I'm an ASEX certified sex educator, an EMDR certified therapist, and an approved consultant. So I'm at the level of being able to teach and consult as well as just do really good trauma work with folks. And practically all of my practices, clients of color, people with some sort of intersecting identity in like queerness or kink or polyamory. And I myself am part of the BDSM community, a woman of color, and um, really, really love the complicated factors, like making sure that your sexuality is not treated as a phase or something that's a result of trauma.
Okay, awesome. Thank you. So that's a mouthful. Why don't we start with the basics for people that, we really need to break it down for them? Can you tell us a little bit about what BDSM is?
Most definitely. So BDSM is a 4-letter acronym that stands for 6 things. That's bondage, discipline, domination, submission, sadism, and masochism. And bondage is anything that has to do with being tied up. That can be things that a lot of folks who are vanilla even consider. Like a lot of people have bought some cheap furry handcuffs from a store like Good Vibrations or something. And although Good Vibes has better than cheap plastic, you should go talk to them if you're in the Bay Area. All the way up to really complicated shibari work, Japanese bondage, which has intricate designs and rope works and with how to tie corsets or do suspension. Discipline usually goes hand in hand with bondage, where there's this aspect of being present and waiting and growing in a practice. But that can also be true within a dominance and submission relationship, where the person who considers themselves submissive is being disciplined and trained to be in devotion or show certain protocols and aspects of being in reverence to the person who is dominant. And some things that people misconstrue about dominance and submission is that inherently there's from the outside looking in, that somehow there's an element of violence to it. And that there's this element of being less than and controlled, but actually what's happening is two people come together who are egalitarian in nature and equal in their worth and control, but they're playing a game in which the submissive temporarily gives over their control and their power. And in that, they're working with elements of power, exchange, discipline, growth work together, things like that. And
that's ideally, right? Ideally, what people should be doing is kind of coming into an agreement.
Ideally.
Yeah. I guess there's a couple of ways I want to back up and go back through this. Okay, so I definitely want to explore more of that. I'm sorry. So I definitely want to explore more.
Yeah, and then just just be sure to let me come back to sadomasochism in case people forget about that one.
Okay. Well, let me let you go ahead with that, and then I'm going to come back with my ideas. How about that?
All right, don't forget that question because I think it's good.
Yes.
The sadism piece has to do with enjoying inflicting pain or punishment on other people. But again, on the far end of one spectrum, it can be something as simple as like light humiliation, like not letting you know that you have something in between your teeth and then saying like, oh, how disgusting, on the way out, to a far further extreme of what people think of in BDSM, which is like being hit with whips, chains, paddles, and things like that. And masochism is, of course, enjoying um, some aspects of pain, punishment, or humiliation.
Awesome. Thank you for breaking that down. There's a lot to sort of, tease out in what you just gave us. The first question I have in what you mentioned in the very beginning is BDSM is not a sexuality phase.
Oh, what I should say is that a lot of people consider themselves in identity with BDSM, like
Mm,
saying that I'm a kinkster, or
mm,
that I'm a rope top, meaning that I really enjoy tying people up in the bondage thing. So a lot of people find identity, like I'm a dominatrix. And in those kind of ways, it's not a phase. It can be very much a through line of somebody's sexuality that on some level they've had in them since they were children, even though they may not be practicing it in an adult way until later in life.
mm, mm. The other piece, thank you for sharing that. The other piece that I was curious about is that when you talked about, sort of the dominance and the rope tying and, the submissiveness, how it's an understood relationship in which one of you are you're understanding that one of you is dominant, but in the other one submissive, and it's more or less a role you're playing. But you understand that you're both equal, but it's just a role that you're playing. So going back to that, um, how does one understand, or how can one determine the difference between a role that you're choosing to play versus a role that someone is abusing?
Hmm. So again, like some people have an identity in it, and you'll meet some people who are saying, like, I always felt service oriented, or I always felt like I submitted to people. I'm happiest in doing for people. And on some level, they're keying into there's an aspect of my identity that is in submission. And, or it could be that there's an aspect of yourself that isn't very at the surface, but you want to explore. So, like, it's very common for a lot of people who are high powered boss women in most of their lives wanting to be like, I don't want to be strong and independent all the time. This is tiring. It's actually really fun to be told what to do, or at least in the container of a BDSM relationship, or what we call a scene, which is like a designated time and space where you're going to act that way.
Mm,
Within the container of the DS, it can be fun to shed and explore a part of yourself that's not always the whole aspect of you. And
mm,
that's some of the role kind of things. And then if you really want to make sure that you don't come across someone who's abusing it, it most often is going to happen with someone posing as dominant. Um, this is going to relate to that. It's going to come down a lot to making sure that that person is uh, is treating the other person as having full autonomy and control over what they're signing up to do, full information about that. Nobody is a true, we, in the BDSM community, we tease with this term too submissive with a W, or too dominant. Some abusers will tell you like, oh, if you were too submissive, you would XYZ, you would be on all fours all the time. You would just want to serve. Why wouldn't you know to do that? Or, and it's a steady chipping away at your self-esteem, when in
mm,
fact, this is not inherent to anyone, and it's nothing wrong that you did. It should be something fun and pleasurable and interesting for both people to explore an aspect of themselves, not a way to degrade, not a way to tear you down for not catering to every aspect of one person's supposed needs.
absolutely. Thank you so much for breaking that down. Um, and I do want to definitely revisit that because I do think, to avoid getting caught up or avoid an abusive situation, I would like to see if maybe you could spell out um, some red flags in that. But I also I want to come back to that because I want to start with if people are curious about BDSM, right? Or if they're curious about exploring that. Because I think sometimes that's where the abuse may start, where you're not really aware of what to look for, or that kind of thing. And I know that a lot of people encounter danger in sort of being a newbie and wanting to explore, but not really knowing. So maybe we'll start there first, and you could tell us, like, if someone's curious about that, right? They want to explore whether this is something that they're really into, or if it's a phase. What do you recommend in terms of exploring your sexuality in those realms?
Definitely. And even so, we had just talked about kink as an identity, but it can also be something that people are just curious about. Like, I want to spice up my sex life. And sometimes there are people who are in mostly vanilla relationships and they're just like, why don't we go to the store and try on some bondage, or do you like these leather cuffs? And I'll
Yes.
type the 4 posts. That's all fine too. And if you're in a healthy relationship already with a partner where you just want to explore a particular
Mm,
kink, um, like a paddle or um, or sensation play, like alternating an ice cube or hot wax, then you should go ahead and find places that are reputable to teach you how to do these things
mm,
safely. Um, and when we talk about safer sex practices in general, we recognize that no sex is totally safe, right?
mm-hmm,
And in the BDSM community, there's especially an awareness of doing risk aware consensual kink or safe, sane consensual kink. There's a couple more acronyms, but those are sometimes the most popular. Uh, which simply means that all kink comes with risk. So even if you and I have been in a healthy, committed, loving relationship
absolutely.
for 5 years, and then we decide we want to tie each other to a bed, well, it would probably be important to know not how to cut off circulation to your pinky finger, because you might want to use your pinky finger
Whoops.
after after this fun little game we're trying out.
Mhm.
So, somebody can make sure that the person that they're playing with actually has a sense of risk and is going to go through their
Yeah.
own risk and yours. That might mean including negotiation up front. It has to be included when you're playing with someone new. Anyone who's just like lays out a bunch of stuff on a bed and says, don't worry about it, is not someone safe to play with. They need to know your
Mm.
history, like, oh, by the way, I have this shoulder injury. You may not want to strap me back to the bed that way. Um, you should know that I struggle with depression. And somewhere after this, I might have a really bad low for a couple of days. All of that needs to be talked about up front. Uh, and you want to make sure that someone isn't just coming off of a DM chat or a match, or like the oftentimes OK Cupid has the option to talk about kink in their checklists. Some of my clients will start looking for potential partners through normal dating site functions,
Mm.
but they may not, anybody that you just find in a vanilla kind of dating site may not be reputable. And that said, anybody you find in FetLife, a very specific site for kinksters that is national and global, may also not be reputable. Anybody can sign up a profile, and you still need to do your vetting and due diligence. So I suggest usually to people meeting in a public place, the same way you might want to meet up for coffee dates with someone vanilla that you're thinking about dating for the first time. Don't invite them to your house or use your number until you're sure.
Okay.
Anybody who's really interested in kink should be willing to meet you at some place reputable, like Good Vibrations, or at a store educators who are knowledgeable, or at within, like here in the Bay Area, we have Folsom Street. That was like the birthplace of a lot of the kink scene. And you could go to some place like Society of Janus or Wicked Grounds,
Very good. Thank you so much for that.
where they, yeah.
Yeah. For people that are looking to explore, before you even get to that, you had mentioned, I mean, you mentioned some things that I wasn't even aware. I didn't even know you could kind of indicate these things on OkCupid or other websites like that. Makes sense that you're able to do that. You mentioned reputable websites that people can go to. Are there some websites that are more reputable than others in terms of exploring kink, or that are less risky?
Yeah, the big ones, I think where people, um, I don't know if I can say that there's some place that's not reputable,
Okay.
because there's also so many intersections, like queer folks who might find each other through something like Grindr. It's kind of hard to say, like, just don't go to one place,
Sure.
but how you talk about it is most important. How people are willing to engage in risk aware kink or not, or negotiate with you and know what's going to be safe and make the other person feel safe is
Sure.
important.
Sure. Okay. Fair enough. Can you tell me a little bit about, once we get into the exploration, how can we distinguish between what's kinky and what's abusive?
Thankfully, the same kind of principles we might apply to a vanilla relationship about abuse do apply to BDSM. So I was telling you before we met, like, about Army Hammer, who's still gaining some traction in the news. He's a actor who is losing roles left and right now. Like, he was going to star in something with Letitia Wright and another thing with Jennifer Lopez. And because he's got all these sexual assault allegations, uh, the Disney is pulling out. What people are kind of keying into is the salacious piece and not the sexual assault pieces of how he slowly groomed some of these women, like a model named Paige Lorenz, and abused his wife of 10 years. And instead, they're keying into the really specific fetishes and kinks that he was bringing into those uh, abusive relationships. Like a lot of the titles are saying like cannibalism and Army Hammer. Like, he was telling them, I want to remove your rib and eat it. And that's a little bit more on the extreme
Yeah.
end. Uh, Even for fetishes, like most people, like some of the most common fetishes are leather, or like smelling leather, or wanting corsetry, or beyond bondage, like light paddles or impact play is what we call it. But there are fetishes that have to do with things like branding, or um, uh, the kind of fetish he was saying in I'd like to eat your rib, or I'd wonder what it'd be like to, uh, disclaimer, full disclaimer now for people who are like, this is a lot for me, you should skip ahead maybe. But like, if you go and read the subjects, he was telling women things like, I'd like to eat your heart. And people are like, oh, where's this line of serial killer and kink or
Wow.
abuser? Well, the line is that you should, that what he did instead was just kind of mass text and never check in with how comfortable his partners were when he was saying these fantasies. If you're going to bring up something like, I think your ribs are so beautiful, I sometimes have this fantasy of eating them, although I'd never do it. Is that okay? Like, can I tell you more about it? There was no checking in whatsoever.
Hmm.
And then there's blowing past other people's discomfort. So one of the things I always tell people to look for is the 3 E's in abusiveness. One is a lack of empathy. So that one's kind of a smoothing over
Yeah.
lack of empathy.
Yeah.
Another is entitlement, and another is exploitation. And there
Mm.
was all of that in each of these relationships. So for instance, Paige Lorenz was 22 years old and fresh out of another relationship that she was grieving. And he's in his 30s and married. But he doesn't tell these women on the side that he's married. And he doesn't, and he's on some level preying on her vulnerability that she's in heartbreak and she doesn't really know much about new relationships or
Mm.
kink, and therefore he can kind of take her under his wing in a way that makes the power dynamic immediately lopsided, not totally egalitarian.
Mm.
And I think some dominance, you know, you if you're totally new to things and you want to find someone who's done this a long time, it makes sense to reach out to someone who's like, oh, I've been practicing this for a while. Maybe you'd be into it. And some women are going to be, some survivors, some women, some people are going to be like, yes, I'm ready. That sounds interesting. Um, and your dominant should not be your only teacher. I really also key people into making sure that anyone who wants to play with you, who knows you're brand new, should be giving you a wealth of information so you don't feel totally indebted or dependent on just this one person. You can go to the educators at the shops you just mentioned, or you can find a group of submissives on a board like FetLife and talk about, like, here are some things I'm interested in doing with this person. What do you all think? But it shouldn't just come from one person. And that's exploitive if on some level they don't want to encourage you to explore everything about your sexuality. It's also exploitive for them to throw everything that they want to do out at you and not key
Mm.
into like what brings you to this scene.
Mm-hmm.
And it's disempowering if what they're doing immediately is figuring out how to get you into a submissive relationship where you're giving up control inherently without thinking about how they're going to extend it back to you and have rituals of giving you back control or checking in.
Mm. Very excellent points. I'm glad you broke it down that way because I think that's helpful for people to know. The other piece that I'm wondering about is, when people already have, you know, an unhealthy or maybe abusive dynamic already. As I've seen so many people that have that, and a lot of people are just like, I want to fix things, or I want to please things with my partner. Please my partner. Can you talk a little bit about how that may show up in unhealthy BDSM dynamics? Like, I just want to please my partner, whereas it may not necessarily would have been something that they would do on their own, but more or less something so that they can keep the relationship intact.
And that's another thing that I found so wise from Paige Lorenz's account of what happened to her with Army Hammer, because she said something to that effect, where she's like, you know, women were essentially socialized to want to be down. You know, like, I don't want to be like those other girls who said you just kind of sprinkled into the conversation, are so uptight or prude, or like, yeah, I want to feel fun and seem exciting. So there's this slow erosion of your boundaries if an abuser keys into the fact that you're already willing to forego your discomforts and sense of safety to please. And
Mm-hmm.
and we need to think about how this society especially socializes women to be pleasers in relationships, that it's your job to fix things if it's right. Like some women who've been conditioned to stay in abusive relationships that are
Yes.
vanilla are told by family members, like, you know, men are going to cheat, they're gonna be dogs, what matters is that he's coming home. What did you do? Did
Mm.
you stop with him? You know, there's usually a wondering of like, well, if someone was cheating, it must be that they were just satisfied in the bedroom even without kink. So it's not too big a leap for someone to be like, maybe I'll use kink to solve that issue. But also
Mm-hmm.
people will open up and I'll do polyamory to solve that issue. Maybe I'll do a threesome, even though I feel really insecure about that. Maybe I'll completely disregard my needs or have another baby. All of those things are about overstepping your own sense of self and boundaries and needs in a
Mm,
desperate attempt to keep someone.
mm,
And not unique to kink,
absolutely.
just unique to the abuser.
Absolutely. Yeah, definitely. The other thing that I was thinking of as you were talking is that we had mentioned, or that you had mentioned, in kind of going over things that, someone may be privy to depression after going through some BDSM acts, or, just in terms of looping that into the discussion. I guess my question is that, is there extra precautions that someone who has a known mental health issue should follow when engaging in acts of BDSM?
Thank you for bringing that back up, Natalie. So first, I should also say that in BDSM, there's a common structure of how people come together to engage in a kink, which is called a scene. And a scene has three parts: negotiation, play, and aftercare. I'm bringing this up to say that it's important to know that most people have what's called a drop or a sub drop or a top drop at the end of a scene, because you're doing a lot of intense things and engaging in these fringe parts of your fantasies and
Mm,
dreams, and you're intimately involved in someone and with someone, sometimes adding sex. And what it does is it takes your brain on this emotional roller coaster. It's
mm,
releasing tons and tons of oxytocin, dopamine, the bonding chemicals, the serotonin and feel good chemicals, the endorepinephrine, the things that happen when you first meet someone and
mm-hmm,
you're really interested in them and you can't wait for them to call you back, and then you got the text message, but that on 100.
mm-hmm,
Your brain will take you through a huge spike, and that spike of chemical reaction is also what's kind of addictive in a way about kink. And then your brain has a come down in after you're done playing. And that's why aftercare is so important, because in general, even healthy people experience a mini depression
mm-hmm,
while their brain chemicals are trying to balance back out. And if you're already suffering with a mood disorder, like anxiety disorders, depression, bipolar, it typically means that that throws your brain chemicals out of greater balance than the average person. And sometimes people end up in a depression for more than a few hours, maybe a couple of days, maybe a week, depending. And that's why aftercare is so important, because things like cuddling together or talking about like, how do you feel? Like, oh my God, I'm actually really ashamed I said that. I was raised not to do that. Or, here's some chocolate. Like chocolate actually helps boost some of those chemicals
mm-hmm.
back in your body. Let's eat and like make sure that, you call me tomorrow and we can talk about how you feel when you're thinking like a regular person and not um, a a person who's hopped up on chemicals, which you are.
Yes.
uh, so that's really what it comes down to. It's not necessarily going to make you depressed. It's not going to cause clinical depression the way you or I would um, uh, diagnose in somebody.
Mm,
But if you already have it, it can complicate it, and then most people feel a low regardless
mm-hmm.
because of the actions.
And thank you. That's something I was not aware of. So I appreciate you breaking that down. Um, I'm curious to know, what does a lack of empathy or entitlement look like in BDSM?
Uh, Again, in the Army Hammer one, which I'm just fascinated
Yeah.
with, uh, I think some of the lack of empathy was that there's a clear steamrolling of boundaries. Like when he kept pressing two of the women, Paige and Courtney, about eating a rib or something. And Paige was talking about, I was just laughing it off, ha ha ha, because she wants to be down. Right. And he's fun and he's cute and he's an actor and it's
Yeah.
3 months in. So in general, like when you're in a new relationship, you overlook some things. So anyway, he, you can see her ha-ha-haing, and then kind of changing the subject, and then eventually outright saying like, no, I'm not going to do that. But then after she says no, he immediately is like, well, I could always call this doctor that I know. And she was telling some reporters about concierge doctors in Hollywood. Like you can, actors can have a doctor on call to, and different specialists to come up and do random things if you needed them to. But I think this is where this is an example of where if people can't respect your no's, then that should be a very clear red flag. Uh, Women who can't say no often find men who only want to say yes to their needs.
Yeah.
And then also specifically in BDSM scenes, what that might look like is the two of you came together to do a very specific thing. Like, I want to be tied to a 4-poster bed and that's it. And then maybe it's like, all we're going to do is you're going to like tickle me. But if somewhere in there, somebody also is like, wouldn't it also be fun to blindfold you? Or wouldn't it also be fun if I took pictures? What they're doing is overstepping the original agreements. And they're doing so in a place where you're running off of these chemical imbalances we talked about, and you're more likely to say yes.
Yeah.
That is dangerous. And sometimes it's deliberate. Sometimes the person is knowing that you're more vulnerable and more likely to say yes now that we're in it, because you don't want to hurt my feelings, because you're high on oxytocin. And you need to be able to say, like, let's get to the next time. Yeah, like feathers would be really fun here, or adding ice cubes. But, I just want to see how I do with the tickling, like we talked about. And that's okay, because if this goes really well and we talk about how well it went during aftercare, that only means that we've gained trust and we can do something more in greater trust the next time. But people who are abusive just want their way right then.
Yes. Yes. Absolutely. I totally 100% agree with you. You mentioned that someone not responding to your boundary of saying no is definitely a red flag. For the women, or for the people, I won't say women, or for the people who always say yes, is that also a red flag?
Yes, and I think a lot of women, especially survivors, come to BDSM because on some level they've heard about this consent piece that is so important in negotiation. And they're like, oh, great. Then I'll find someone who is in control and capable and dominant, who will just take care of all of it. And women who are especially socialized to say yes are sometimes thinking that they're submissive, when in reality, they've just not totally explored all the ways in which we've been conditioned to be passive. And we can keep using women, although it's gendered and it doesn't have to be. I've certainly worked with men, gender nonconforming folks, and trans folks of all types who struggle with the same thing. Um, and so what you really want to make sure you're doing, if you're a survivor of sexual abuse or intimate partner violence, and you're looking for BDSM to be healing, is that you have to really do some trauma work up front to make sure that you don't dissociate, that is, check out of your body, and that you can be an active participant the whole way through, because BDSM is not good when it's passive. It's good when it's interactive. Like, your dom needs to be like, I think that bottom can take a little bit more, don't you think? You need to be able to say, yes, more please, dom, more please, sir, mistress. But if you can't, because you haven't healed your sexual abuse and you were used to your abuser doing whatever they please to you, then at that point you're going to, a lot of survivors have this experience of checking out, coming to, realizing that they agreed to or let happen a lot of things they didn't want to. And then they the dom sometimes didn't know that that's what was happening, but they get blamed for sexual abuse or rape as a result. But, you know, while we've been talking a lot about people who intentionally steamroll in a way
Sure.
that's exploitative, there are ways to just make mistakes in consent violations because one person didn't know, or because somebody got excited and they kept going when someone actually was nonverbal and meant to stop. That is part of risk-aware kink.
Sure.
That I didn't know that my trauma history would come up and I'd start feeling like a 5-year-old. But now that it's here, I need to be willing to say that was just something unexpected and nobody's at fault. Hopefully, you've done some vetting and the two of you set some containers where you knew you could talk about that. And this person said, I wouldn't take advantage of that. And then you can just put yourselves back together and figure out how not to let that happen again.
Mm, mm. Yes, and thank you so much for that. The other topic that is very intriguing to me, which you've kind of touched on in this last piece, is people who've had trauma, or people who've had some sort of sexual trauma or relationship trauma, who then say, I want to, explore kink. Um, and I'm curious about that in terms of, you know, is it kink or is it trauma that you're kind of reenacting yourself, that people may want to reenact, something such as rape based, um, fantasies turning into rape based sex or things like that, things that like that may come up. I'm curious to know about that.
For sure. And what I'm going to say, Natalie, is it's complicated.
All right. I'm ready. Give it to me, girl.
So we're along the ride, just strap in.
Yeah.
So first of all, the rape-based fantasy, or we'll call them also ravishment fantasies, are really common for folks who are vanilla and for folks who aren't interested in kink, folks who aren't survivors. Like, it's actually a very common fantasy for women specifically.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and we have to think about the reasons why, because fantasies are not always things we really want to act on. They're more like dreams. They're symbolism. And for a lot of women who are raised to be passive, as we've talked about, raised to be people pleasers and and raised not to have a sexuality unless unless that makes you a slut or out there or fast or something. You know, how do you even come into your sexuality with all of these messages that are meant to keep women down, right?
Yeah.
So, what happens in the rape-based fantasy or the ravishment fantasy is you're freed of that. Like, I don't have to somehow figure out how to ask for what I want at the same time, not look like I want it, and be stressed out with that, because there's this person who is so overcome with desire for me that they have to have me right then and there, or there's the rape represents passion, or it can represent taboo. Like, this person wants me so bad that they're willing to create a criminal act or do a criminal act to have it, or I can somehow defend my honor, but really have like great rough sex at the same time. And in that way, that's the kink. Like, I want rough sex, but I
Mm-hmm.
can't just ask for it. So the rape fantasy is common for people outside of kink just as well. But sexual assault survivors are also sometimes trying to resolve their trauma on some level. Like, they may come to kink wanting what's called consensual non-consent. Like, they set up a scene with a dominant, usually, because they're going to want to play the submissive as the quote unquote rape victim. And they're trying to get up into a point in their actual rape where they maybe went nonverbal or couldn't fight back. And they're like, at that point, I want to really push back, or they're trying to do something that circumvents the trauma. And when I do this kind of presentation within the kink community, I talk about the three C's to combat the three E's: consent, compassion, and circumvention. You need all three to do a really good consent,
Mm-hmm.
non-consent scene. You need to be compassionate with this person where they think I'm going to be able to fight back at that time, and then maybe they can't. And then the survivor might beat themselves up because their body goes into these normal defenses. You need to have consent in that it's really clear at this point, you're going to take the paddle out of my hand. And that's when we're going to have sex, maybe. Um, or I'll pin down your arms, just your arms, and that's when we'll have sex, you know? So it
Mm-hmm.
needs to be drawn out very specifically what I'm consenting to. I didn't say at that point, take the paddle back from me and then beat me wherever, because that's what my dad would do.
Yeah.
And then it brings me back. It triggers me to come back to being hit willy-nilly by my parents. Um, and both people, that's why trauma work is so important, because if a survivor hasn't done enough work to know some of their
Mm-hmm.
triggers, it's really a minefield for both of them.
Mm.
um, and then, so we talked about consent, and then the circumvention. So yes, mom might have pulled something out of my hand and said, how dare you raise your hand or your voice back to me. But then what's going to be different in this scene? My dom can't say that exactly, or my dom can't take the paddle out of my hand the same way my mom did, because then my body's going to go in fight, flight, or freeze. So how are we going to give power back to you in this scene so that you're able to move through it, help your
Yeah.
body move through this trauma with new information, new adaptive information, that I'm doing this with
Yeah.
someone safe who cares about my well-being, and I stay in control, because that's not what I had when I was actually being raped or abused. I had no control or power.
Hmm. Very excellent points. One of the questions that I definitely want to be sure to ask is, what if someone has explored BDSM or has explored kink and things have gone too far? Meaning that, maybe they do feel like they were abused or exploited or something like very similar to what you're talking about in the case that's in the news. What should
Mhm.
they do?
So it what we I like to let survivors know that they have options, because this was a very disempowering experience. So I never presume to tell somebody what they need to do.
Sure,
Even in the vanilla world, if you're sexually assaulted, we can tell one person, oh, you have to report, you
sure.
should go to the police. But that person's like, well, maybe for someone else, but I'm a sex worker, or I don't trust the police, I was abused by the police, or they never respond to my neighborhood,
Yeah.
or things like that. And all of that's still going to apply, but with intersections in the kink community. There's people like, I don't want to put myself in this person at risk and make them lose their kids because now they think that person's a pervert if they're going through the court system. And that can be valid. Um, but some people are like, screw this person, they're terrible and a predator, and they need to have all the consequences. And then that can be valid. So you might still go to the police, and there are some, like especially here in San Francisco, they've been dealing with the kink community for years. We have a
Yeah.
very long kink community, so the San Francisco police have some understanding of how to support people in the BDSM community. May not be as true everywhere. There's that risk. You could also go into a dungeon space when you play and tell the dungeon monitors. There are people, volunteers in most of these spaces and in these communities that specifically look to bar predators from coming in and making everybody unsafe, right? So if
Mm.
you're like, look, this guy is walking around masquerading as a dominant, this woman, this person, um, went way past my limits when I specifically set my safe word, or didn't adhere to things we laid out in negotiation. Well, now word of mouth travels,
Yeah.
and at least if you're playing in the BDSM scene, the greater scene, then um, oftentimes the play spaces where this happens, or the connection, the consortium of happy hours and meetups, start looking out for this person, or other mentors come to them and may address them in a sit down where they try and mediate the situation. Um, I've also, you know, what's happened here in the Bay Area, especially, is that there's all these sub communities that didn't exist 20 years ago. Like with the tech boom came a lot of high powered, abusive, um, idle people who are creating their own little parties and niches that are not really part of the general consortium of the greater BDSM community. And they're not following risk aware consensual kink, or the sane model. They set up all these parties specifically to get like young hot women there and then exploit them in a kind of like a cultish fashion. Um, so you're going to have a harder time there finding anyone in a culture that doesn't have consent,
Sure.
that is akin to a DM or a dungeon monitor. But you should still try and exercise your vehicles of finding community and finding help with other survivors. I would suggest going to agencies that work with and advocate for survivors, like or San Francisco Women Against Rape, to find healing and to work through whether or not this really was correct. And sometimes just finding community can be the next best place.
Yes. I agree with some of what you're saying, a lot of what you're saying. The one caveat I wonder about is, what if this is closer to home? What if this is, this abusiveness takes place between you and a spouse, or you and a partner that you're involved in? Do your recommendations differ?
Yeah, it depends. So, it depends on what the person needs. So sometimes, if we're going to go back to kink as an identity, I do want to recognize that within that survivor, there may be a kink that you want to reclaim and take back. And there should be something outside of you and your abuser that you're able to hold on to for healing. Like, let's say it was your idea to try bondage because it's something you always wanted. Um, well, there's ways to do that in a self-empowered way. Like maybe you learn some Bari techniques that you can tie around your own foot.
Yeah.
Or, maybe it's a matter of like, I'm going to get in touch with this for my own sexuality. And it doesn't always have to be to please my partner or keep them or spice up something in this sex life. And if my partner is forcing me to do something that I don't like, I would just follow the same steps that I would with any intimate partner violence. Need a safety plan for the next time that this person may force something on you. If you're not ready to leave, how are we going to do some things to make things like as less harmful as possible? Like, oh, my partner doesn't do all this to me if the kids are in the next room, at least, or maybe I can bide some time and leave for the night, go to my sister's. We could do the same safety planning. You might need an advocate or a therapist to help.
Great, thank you. And while we live in the Queen City of Kink, San Francisco, I'm sure that there are other people who may live in places that are not so kink aware or not so kink friendly, and may find themselves in hairy situations where there is abuse, or things have gone too far, things have gotten really scary. And it sounds like San Francisco, they have police and law enforcement that are very aware of these things. But what can people do if they live in a city that's not as aware, or not as friendly, or not as open about kink, and they may need help?
I would suggest reaching out to some online networks. So toshra.org is a good place for
Okay.
kink research, kink aware professionals. And sometimes there's kink aware therapists like myself who you can get in touch with within your state who are licensed in your community or near
Okay.
you. You can, and then that the organization as a whole is national and can sometimes get you and get resources
Okay.
outside of that. And you can also go on FetLife and try and find some community support boards. There are boards for people who've been abused within kink and sometimes talk about it and share posts. So again, you can find community. If you just don't have a dungeon space near you or a wicked grounds or some place where with a really huge following. But thankfully, because of the internet, it's sometimes really easy to get connected with more people than you thought who are within your area or your community that way.
That's amazing. Thank you so much, Quandra. I've learned a wealth of information from you, and I'm sure my listeners have too. For people that want to connect with you or interested in talking more with you, can you tell them how to find you?
Most definitely. So my website is www.sastherapy.com. That's snake apple snake snake therapy.com. And you can email me, Quandra at sastherapy.com, and follow me at sastherapy on IG and Twitter. I am the only one who answers the phone number or the email, so feel free to drop me a line. Don't leave anything too specific or detailed about yourself on my IG or Twitter. And I'm unfortunately full, but I will do my best to connect you to resources and do what I can. And I may open up some spots in a month or two.
Awesome. And I know that people are probably itching to get on that list when you do open up. So thank you so much, Quandra. Okay, so now that you've heard what Quandra had to say about BDSM, love to hear what your thoughts are on that. So please drop a comment down below, send me a message, or leave a note on social media. Can't wait to hear what your thoughts are. And thank you so much. And be sure to tune in next week because we have a great show planned with Quandra on EMDR as well. Thank you so much.